Thank you, Professor Brodie. And thanks to Ramona as well to both of you for the opportunity to speak to you today about this topic. As Alexander mentioned, this is a topic that I worked on between 2002 and 2005, and then again for a little while before publishing a book on Heidegger metaphysics and the Univocity of Being. So this has been an opportunity to go back to a topic that's really important, I think, that links Scottish philosophy in the Middle Ages through a detour in Germany, but to 20th century French philosophy and indeed to contemporary European thought. When I started looking back over it, I realised just how big a topic it was. So you'll forgive me in that my paper is somewhat of a summary of the area that will hopefully take us from medieval Europe, the figure of Scotus, through Heidegger to Deleuze. So, the Univocity of Being is a radical philosophical proposal, taken in abstraction from any particular instance of the doctrine identified by a proper name in the history of philosophy. We might begin to characterise this thesis in the following way. The Univocity of Being proposes that there is one prevailing meaning of the term being, that the term being is applied to all that it is applied with the same identical meaning, that the things referred to by the term being have the same nature, definition, essence and reference. In fact, the univocal concept of being is aligned with the modern view of existence taken by some philosophers in the analytic tradition. Peter van Eenwagen has summarised the post-Quinian view of existence as follows. 1. Being is not an activity. Being is not something that beings do, like walking or sleeping. 2. Being and existence are the same thing. There are no unactualised possible beings, Or alternatively put, existence is not a property of a class of things within being. 3. Existence is univocal. The concept of existence has the same meaning whenever it is applied and to whatever it is applied. There might be different kinds of beings, concrete and abstract for instance, but they exist in the same sense. The difference between concrete things and abstract things is in their properties or natures, but not in the way that they exist. 4. The Univocity of Being or existence is captured adequately by the existential quantifier in the notation of first-order predicate logic, as in statements of the kind, there is an X such that. 5. The parties in ontological disputes should examine the implications of what they wish to affirm exists, and they should attempt to do so in the quantifier variable idiom. This contemporary version of the Univocity of Being would provide the metaphysical backdrop to contemporary naturalism. When we do attach a proper name to the doctrine of univocity in the figure of the medieval Scottish philosopher John Duns Scotus, we can begin to get a sense of the controversy surrounding this metaphysical thesis in the history of philosophy. To do so, we need only invoke the interpretation of it offered by perhaps univocity's most radical modern proponent, Gilles Deleuze. The problem with univocity is that it threatens to collapse God's transcendence of his creatures and, at the same time, lead to a conception of God in anthropological terms. The doctrine of univocity, by that doctrine rather, both God and creature or man are said to be in the same sense. Deleuze puts it like this. The greatest thinker of the Middle Ages says yes, being is univocal, and in a seminar delivered at Vincennes in January 1974, he hints at the heretical implication of this position. He says, fortunately, however, he had taken precautions. He said, yes, but be careful, being is univocal insofar as it is being. That is to say, it is metaphysically univocal. He said, sure, it's analogical, which is to say that it's said in several senses physically. This is what interests me, Deleuze says. He was at the border of heresy. Had he not specified metaphysically univocal and physically analogical, he would have been done for. Well, it's more proper to say that for Scotus, the univocity of being operates at the conceptual or logical level, and the analogy operates at the metaphysical level. What is important for Deleuze is that Scotus was thinking at the border of heresy because of this doctrine. 8 years earlier, in his The Order of Things, Foucault had suggested that it is just such borders or points of heresy that are the controversies that speak to the very dominance of the one episteme that defines the conditions of possibility of all knowledge in an epoch, and as such, they represent a possible liberation from it. Deleuze's remark concerning Scotus is no throwaway line. Univocity is a radical possibility. It is the possibility of an emancipatory thought. In the 13th century, the Aristotelians held that the term being was not univocal, but analogous. Analogy was regarded as the middle way between univocity and equivocity. If the term being were univocal, then it would maintain the same meaning across all its instances. If it were equivocal, then its meanings would be totally diverse, without connection whatsoever. As analogous, being has different but nevertheless related meanings. The term applies primarily and properly to God, and secondarily or by extension to creatures. Analogy maintains God's transcendence and enables natural knowledge of him derived from our knowledge of creatures. God's wisdom is to God as our wisdom is to us. Univocity collapses God's transcendence. God is in the same sense as a creature. And equivocity renders natural knowledge of God impossible. God's being has nothing in common with our being. If being were univocal, so the argument goes, God could not be said to properly transcend a creature, since his being and the being of the creature would carry the same meaning. This would imply that they belong to the same metaphysical order. Against equivocity, analogy maintains that God is naturally knowable, since by analogical reasoning it is possible, however imperfectly, to reason from creature to God. If being were equivocal, such reasoning would be impossible, precisely because of the lack of commonality between the senses of being. If God's being is in no sense like that of a creature, then in what sense can we be said to know anything about him? Radically, Scotus broke with this view that being is analogical and argued that there must be a notion of being and of the other transcendentals that is univocal to God and creatures, and also to the 10 categories. Although Scotus's philosophy can be read in relation to the Thomistic philosophy of analogy, the critical bent of his work was aimed primarily at Henry of Ghent. Henry was a neo-Augustinian critic of Aquinas and the most important theologian of the preceding generation. In large part, Scotus takes Henry's positions as his point of departure. In particular, Scotus's thesis of the Univocity of being can be read as a critical reaction to Henry's distinctive interpretation of the doctrine of the analogy of being. Scotus's qualification of Thomistic philosophy is a byproduct of his qualified attack on Henry. In essence, this qualification is not that analogy is wrong, it is that analogy presupposes univocity. Henry's version of analogy for Scotus made explicit the problems facing the doctrine in accounting for the human being's natural knowledge of God. The problem is, how do we maintain the possibility of attaining at least some knowledge of God's divine nature from our knowledge of creatures, while at the same time maintaining his absolute transcendence of them? In order to preserve God's absolute transcendence, it is important to stress that his divine nature has nothing creaturely about it. God has no reality in common with creatures. The problem then becomes, how can any knowledge of God be gained from the creature? Henry and Scotus both held that natural knowledge of God was possible. Henry's attempt to account for the creature's natural knowledge of God was bound up with his revised version of the analogy of being. According to that doctrine, being and the other transcendentals apply to God in a primary sense, and to creatures in a related secondary sense. As Henry says, being therefore does not belong to God univocally, nor purely equivocally, but in a middle way, namely by analogy, because it signifies one thing primarily and principally, and the other as in some way ordered, related, or proportional to what is primary. And in this way, being, in the most common sense, primarily signifies God, secondarily creature. The primary instance of being, the focal reference or meaning of the term to which everything else is related by analogy, is a being of a particular kind, God. Scotus argued that being and the other transcendentals were univocal, not only when applied to substance and accident, but also when applied to God and creature. On his view, only univocity could establish the creature's natural knowledge of God. Henry argued that the concept of being ultimately reduced into two completely separate notions. First, infinite being, that is proper to God, and second, finite being, or the universal concept of being, proper to the categories and to creatures. These two concepts exhausted being. There could be no third notion, distinct from finite being and infinite being, that would be univocal to God and creature, because univocity would collapse God's transcendence. In opposition to this, Scotus argued that a univocal concept of being is necessary if any claim to knowledge of God is justified. He says, I say that God is conceived not only in a concept analogous to the concept of a creature, but even in some concept univocal to himself and to a creature. Scotus argued that Henry could not consistently hold that being resolved into two discrete notions, with no conceptual community between them, and at one and the same time, the natural knowledge of God could be deduced from creatures. Of the arguments he has for univocity, the most famous is his argument from certain or doubtful concepts. He says, in this life already a man can be certain in his mind that God is a being and still be in doubt whether he is a finite or an infinite being, created or an uncreated being. Consequently, the concept of being as affirmed of God is different from the other two concepts, but is included in both of them and is therefore univocal. This argument rejects Henry's view that there could be no univocal concept of being, and that being resolved into two analogous notions, one proper to God and the other to creatures. Scotus's point is that since it is possible to doubt whether God is finite or infinite, while still being certain that he is a being, the concept of being is not simply reducible to two notions. Rather, the concept of being is not confused as it had been for Henry, but distinct. It is distinct from the concepts of infinite and finite being, which Scotus will argue are contracted to God and to creatures by virtue of the intrinsic modes of infinity and finitude, which do not modify being extrinsically through some kind of real addition, but simply qualify being as infinite or finite in the same way that a certain degree of intensity qualifies something that is white. That the first premise of the argument from certain and doubtful concepts is true is taken by Scotus to be evident from the fact that any given intellect cannot be at once doubtful and certain of the same thing at one and the same time. But the second premise is true is attested by the fact that past philosophers have disagreed over whether the first principle is finite or infinite, material or immaterial, while maintaining that it is nonetheless a being. From this, the concept of being must be distinct from finite and infinite, God and creature, and be equally applicable to all of these. That God is or is not infinite, that God is not an infinite or a finite being is a matter of demonstration, but demonstration of this fact must start from something certain about God, for otherwise it would proceed from doubtful concepts. As such, the concept of being must be admitted as certain, as distinct from the concepts of finite and infinite. If this is not admitted, then no reasoning about God is possible. The univocity of the concept of being is therefore necessary for any reasoning about God to be possible. For this reason, Scotus claimed that theologians who explicitly denied a concept of univocal being nevertheless implicitly relied upon it. He says, every inquiry regarding God is based upon the supposition that the intellect has the same univocal concept which it obtained from creatures. Deleuze's suggestion is that the specific threat to Scotus in the context of the medieval worldview, as a result of his departure from the dominant analogical concept of being and his adoption of a univocal account, was that his thought would become mad. And as a result, had he not taken the philosophical precautions that Deleuze suggests, he would have been done for. In the Middle Ages and until the Renaissance, as Foucault has argued, man's dispute with madness was a dramatic debate in which he confronted the secret powers of the world. Before the advent of the classical age in the 17th century, when madness became seen as a descent into animality with no human significance, Foucault suggests that it had been regarded as something essentially human and that it represented a meaningful challenge to reason. No matter how abhorrent it was understood to be an alternative mode of human being. It is in just these terms we might think that Deleuze reads Scotus's philosophy of univocity. The univocity of being threatened to cross the heretical line into madness. As such, univocity would present a meaningful but mad challenge to the rationality of the analogical participatory universe. For Deleuze, in theology, if not in philosophy too, what he finds most interesting are such limit points at which heresy peaks out. 100 years ago, Martin Heidegger gave us a clue to the situation in the Middle Ages that sheds some more light on this debate over univocity and analogy. In his 1917 book notice to his Scotus book, he puts the situation like this. While the concept of analogy discussed in this investigation in regard to the problem of metaphysical reality appears at first glance to be an utterly faded and no longer meaningful schoolbook concept, as the dominant principle in the categorical sphere of sensible and supersensible reality, it contains the conceptual expression of the qualitatively filled and value-laden experiential world of medieval man that is related to transcendence. It is the conceptual expression of the particular form of inner Dasein that is anchored in the primordial transcendent relation of the soul to God and lived precisely in the Middle Ages with an unusual reserve. The analogy of being and the metaphysics of participation, as outlined by St. Thomas Aquinas, expresses the form of life of medieval Dasein, and in an analogical participatory universe there is no secular space. By threatening to collapse God's transcendence, in effect reducing him metaphysically so that he is conceived as a being in the same sense as a creature, the univocity of being threatened to diminish God and divinize creation, or worse, to conceive of God as part of the world and so as not at all divine. Only a mad thinker would entertain such a possibility. It was in order to avoid this collapse of God's transcendence and the pantheism that would result, Deleuze suggests, that is the ultimate motivation for Scotus's neutralization of the concept of being, a neutralization that would be undone by Spinoza when univocal being becomes a truly expressive and affirmative proposition. For Todd May, Spinoza was indeed a heretic. His heresy lay in his denial of transcendence and his adoption of radical ontological immanence. Being, on this view, is univocal because, unlike in Scotus's ontology, in reality there is nothing beyond, outside, or superior to immanent substance. There is no transcendence in Spinoza's pure ontology. Deleuze provocatively suggests to his students that people could be burned or tortured for what was at stake in these stories of what seems to be as dead terms like univocity, equivocity, and analogy. In fact, more than any other term, heresy, the term heresy that has been invoked in our discussion, may well signify the quintessential medievalistic moment within the modern popular imagination, conjuring forth visions of pageants of intolerance, showcasing defiant dissenters at the fiery stake in the name of God. In fact, no theologian went to the stake before John Huss in 1415, and while Scotus's contemporary, the secular master Jean Dupuy, did suggest that one should proceed not by arguments, but otherwise against him as a result of his views on the Immaculate Conception of Mary, the actual accusation of heresy made by him against Scotus occurred when Scotus was already dead. According to John Van Buren, Heidegger's Scotus book was written during a period of his intellectual development that can be loosely referred to as mystical and neo-scholastic. Then he approached the categories of being as a timeless ideal framework by virtue of which our intentional judgments can access real being. Real being itself is grounded by God's absolute being. Heidegger's thought at this time was anti-modernist and influenced by Aristotle and the medieval scholastic philosophers. The question of the meaning of being, the guiding question of Heidegger's entire philosophical career, was first brought to his attention in an Aristotelian scholastic setting. In Being and Time, Heidegger sought to approach the question of being through what he termed a fundamental ontology of Dasein. The meaning of the term Dasein is complex, but we can begin to get a handle on it by suggesting that it is Heidegger's term for whatever else it is Heidegger's term for the characteristically human way of being. Dasein means being there, here and now, in a world where one has to act and get on with the business of life. For Heidegger, Dasein is the place where being is revealed. We can think of the term being in Heidegger's sense as roughly equivalent to meaning. Dasein is sensitive to meaning, and meaning is the difference that it makes, that there is something rather than nothing. As Dahlstrom has put it, it is Dasein's timely projection of its world, the unity of its temporal horizons, that provide the sense of being that enables its interactions with interworldly beings. As such, for Heidegger, the univocity of being is revealed in terms of time. Temporality is the condition of the possibility of Dasein's way of being, and it is the transcendental horizon of being itself. Everything Dasein encounters, it encounters in terms of the projection of itself upon possibilities of its being. The meaning of being is grounded in Dasein's temporality. Now, the analogy of being came to be seen by Heidegger by the 1930s as a stringent aporia and as a central plank in metaphysics understood as ontotheology. We can begin to get away into Heidegger's account of ontotheology by considering Scotus's question. Is the proper subject matter of metaphysics being, as Avicenna claims, or God and the intelligences, as the commentator Averroes assumes? That is the proper content and interpretation of Aristotle's metaphysics ontology, the study of beings insofar as they exist, or theology, the study of the first being, the first supreme being? As ontotheology, metaphysics takes some preeminent being or sense of being and generalizes it to all beings. In medieval Christianity, being is understood in terms of creation, conservation, and participation. Modernity, by contrast, deifies the subject. As ontotheology, metaphysics orders beings, classifies them, and explains them, while at the same time it subordinates them to a primary being or primary analogue. Consider Scotus's summary of the distinction of things or beings that he takes will serve as the basis for classifying the difficult metaphysical questions that have been raised hitherto. A thing is primarily classified 1, as created or uncreated, 2, as having being of itself or having it from another, 3, as necessary or possible, 4, as finite or infinite. The uncreated, self-existent, infinite and necessary thing or being we call God. The created, the from another, the possible or contingent, the finite goes by the common name of creature. God is a being, metaphysics is ontotheological. Scotus's classification neatly brings out Heidegger's point that what has been forgotten in the history of metaphysics is what he calls the difference, or the ereignis, whereby being is first given to thought. Ontotheology thinks being as what grounds beings, both by virtue of being common to them all, ontology, and by virtue of there being and by virtue of being their ultimate ground, the supreme being, theology. Ontology and theology are entailed by one another. Only if something exists is it created or caused, and only if there is a creator or cause does something exist. For ontotheology, there is nothing more to say about being. For his part, Heidegger proposed to think the origin of the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics. Doing so was bound up with his move away from some of his earlier positions. For the Heidegger of Being and Time and associated writings, the ontological difference is grounded in Dasein's transcendence of beings towards the meaning of their being. And this understanding of being is inscribed within Dasein's world, Dasein as being in the world. The ontological difference has the mode of being of Dasein. It belongs to existence. By the time of his later being historical thinking, associated with texts like the Contributions to Philosophy, Heidegger had come to see being and time as a work of transition that was still too entangled in the language of the metaphysical tradition. To think the origin of ontotheology, he proposes a step back from metaphysics and its language. He says, the step back points to the realm which until now has been skipped over and from which the essence of truth becomes first of all worthy of thought. Heidegger's claim is that what has been forgotten in the tradition is a pre- or post-metaphysical sense of being that is non-representational and that is the enabling condition of any rendering of the beingness of beings, the many looks that the being of beings has taken on over the course of the history of metaphysics. Heidegger finds this in a principle of difference that produces or grants the between of being and beings, and that is unthinkable in traditional metaphysics. He says, since metaphysics thinks of beings as such as a whole, it represents beings in respect of what differs in the difference, but without heeding the difference as difference. Deleuze shared Heidegger's view that traditional metaphysics is ontotheological, and despite their important differences, for both Heidegger and Deleuze, ontology begins with an original difference. For both Heidegger and Deleuze think of being as event, whether as the event of the sending of being to historical humanity that binds together their fates, or as the event of the repetition of difference. Miguel de Bestegui puts it like this. Deleuze's thought maintains an affinity with Heidegger's in that it remains a thought of ontological difference, which it continues and reinvents, and where the univocity of being reinscribes the meaning of being. The question of being is the question of being's difference from entities. Being is the movement of difference as such, the spatio-temporalizing movement or operation through which there are entities. For Heidegger, this movement of difference is the event of being in its historical unfolding, while for Deleuze it is a process of individuation. Deleuze's difference in repetition can be read as a response to Heidegger's being in time, where difference corresponds to being and repetition to time, and where Deleuze's terms, the virtual and the actual, can very roughly be equated with Heidegger's terms, being and beings. According to the analogy of being, two things that are will be both alike and unlike one another to some extent. Things that are somewhat alike, the analogues, things, attributes, concepts, terms, will be grouped according to the relations of principality or primacy and subordination or minority. When something is a primary analogue, it has what it shares amongst all the other analogues most properly, chiefly and perfectly. Everything else that is related to this primary analogue has the shared property only secondarily. Secondary analogues exhibit the property or perfection in question less perfectly and are referred to the primary analogue and named from it. Analogy for Deleuze is adapted to the forms of God, the world, and the self as primary analogues amongst the things that are, and his version of the Univocity of Being will refuse these metaphysical points of terminus. A version of the thesis of the Univocity of Being underpins his entire philosophy. In essence, the problem with analogy is that it can only approach difference by way of comparison between things. It cannot approach difference in itself, and it cannot provide difference with its own concept. Upholding the Univocity of Being ensures that things differ in exactly the same respect. That is, Univocity will not seek to compare objects that are taken to differ in ontological kind, and instead will approach difference as the continuous variation of one and the same being. Deleuze's interest in univocity thus stems from his concern to construct a metaphysics appropriate to a purely immanent reality, a reality that is free of any absolute transcendence. Claire Colebrook neatly summarises Deleuze's position as follows. There is only one being, but this does not mean that there cannot be radically new events and futures. On the contrary, eternal return and univocity preclude the idea that a state of completion or rest will ever come about. We should neither wait nor hope for a better world, nor should we imagine an apocalyptic break with this world in order to achieve a radical future. If there is only one being, then all life, all futures, all events will be actualizations of this immanent life, which, in its virtual power, can continually create and differentiate new experiences. Eternal return describes a future that is positive because it repeats and affirms life. For Deleuze, the Univocity of being and the project of philosophy completely coincide. Univocity is an ethical as well as an ontological thesis, since in Deleuze the question is no longer what must you do in order to realise your essence, but rather what are you capable of doing by virtue of your power. Ethics for Deleuze is oriented towards the evaluation of actions and intentions according to the immanent mode of existence they imply. As Eric Aliès has put it, if analogy is theological, onto theology, Univocity is ethical, onto ethology. In essence, for Deleuze, philosophy merges with ontology, but ontology merges with the Univocity of being. Analogy has always been a theological vision, not a philosophical one, adapted to the forms of God, the world, and the self. Philosophy is univocal ontology. And thinking the Univocity of being is an essentially non-escapist and life-affirming exercise. On Nathan Wither's reading of Deleuze, his account of Univocity turns out to be the inversion of Scotus's. It affirms the rights of subconceptual differences and does not provide a concept of being that includes beings of the greatest extrinsic difference, such as God and creatures. Deleuze's philosophy as a whole is largely indifferent to the question of the existence of God. And in this respect, Deleuze represents a very different kind of reader of Scotus than does Heidegger, who was never indifferent to theological concerns, and for whom contemporary indifference to questions of the sacred remained a problem for thinking. To conclude this short summary, Scotus argued for the Univocity of being as a coherent and necessary alternative to the analogy of being in order to ground natural knowledge of God. Deleuze, for his part, argued in his 1968 Difference in Repetition that a concern for the Univocity of being can be seen running from Scotus to Spinoza to Nietzsche. He further argues that this concern was taken up in the 20th century, first by Heidegger and then by himself. He says, "There has only ever been one ontological proposition, being is univocal. There has only ever been one ontology, that of Duns Scotus, which gave being a single voice. From Parmenides to Heidegger, it is the same voice which is taken up in an echo which itself forms the whole deployment of the univocal." Scotus represents the first principal moment in Deleuze's secret history of the Univocity of being. For Heidegger, of being and time, the Univocity of being is rooted in Dasein's temporality. Both Heidegger and Deleuze regard metaphysics as ontotheological, and both will reject transcendence in favour of an ontology that begins with difference and that remains immanent. For Deleuze, Univocity will mean that no event or phenomenon is more real than any other, and there is only one being. Perceptions, anticipations, memories, and fictions are as real as atoms, universals, concepts, or bodies. For Deleuze, only Univocity upholds real difference. Differences are fully real, different in themselves, and are not subordinated to a transcendent primary analogue. Univocity implies immanence. There is not a God outside of and transcendent to creation. If there is a divine, then it is nothing other than its immanent expression in this world. There is no dualism of mind and matter. Each is but an attribute of one and the same substance, of the one substance, and each body is just one expression of this one univocal substance. The magic formula is pluralism equals monism. Dualisms are the enemy.